Before New York became a city ruled by law, it was ruled by the street. In the early 1800s, New York City grew faster than its rules. Ships arrived daily, people poured in from Ireland, Germany, and rural America. Buildings rose fast, jobs did not keep pace. Crowded streets filled with fear, hunger, and anger. In that gap, gangs formed. They did not start as crime groups, they began as protection, pride, and survival. At the start of the 1800s, New York City was still learning how to be a city. Its population grew faster than its systems. Ships arrived each day with goods and people. Many came poor, many came desperate. Housing filled fast, jobs did not. Streets narrowed as buildings rose, rooms held entire families. Clean water was scarce, disease spread with speed. Law struggled to keep up. Police forces were small and poorly trained. Many officers lived in the same neighborhoods they patrolled. They faced threats daily. Courts favored wealth and status. For the poor, justice felt distant. This created a dangerous gap. When law felt weak, people turned to each other. Neighborhoods became closed worlds. Each block carried its own rules. Outsiders were treated with suspicion. Young men gathered to protect their streets. They stood together during disputes. They fought rivals who crossed into their space. What began as defense soon turned into identity. The roots of this story begin with immigration. By the 1820s and 1830s, waves of Irish immigrants arrived in New York, many fleeing poverty and political unrest long before the Great Famine of the 1840s intensified the exodus. They came with little money and few connections, and most settled in the city's poorest districts. One of these was Five Points, a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan that quickly became infamous across America. Five Points was built over a former pond that had been drained but never properly filled. The ground was unstable, damp, and unhealthy. Wooden houses leaned against each other, and the streets were narrow and crooked. Sewage ran openly, garbage piled up, and disease spread quickly. Families lived packed into single rooms, sometimes with boarders sharing the same space. Cholera and tuberculosis were common, and life expectancy was short. In such conditions, survival was a daily struggle. The gangs were born from this struggle. They offered protection, belonging, and a sense of power to those who had none. For many young men, joining a gang was the only way to defend themselves in a city where the police were weak and prejudice was strong. Irish immigrants, often despised by native-born Americans, found solidarity in gangs that gave them identity and strength. Five Points became the center of gang life. It was also one of the first true melting pots in America. Irish immigrants lived alongside African Americans, Italians, Germans, and newly freed slaves. Cultures collided daily, and tensions often broke into fights. Out of these fights grew names that would echo across the city. The Bowery Boys were native-born Americans, mostly mechanics and apprentices, who dressed in firemen's uniforms and carried themselves with swagger. They were nativists, proud of their heritage and hostile to immigrants. Their leader, William Poole, became a feared figure, embodying their defiance. Politics soon entered the street. Voting in New York was public. Ballots were cast aloud or in open view. This invited intimidation. Political parties needed muscle. Gangs provided it. Leaders guided voters. They blocked rivals. They guarded ballot boxes. In return, politicians offered protection from arrest and access to favors. Tammany Hall became skilled at this exchange. It gained loyalty from immigrant communities. It provided food, jobs, and legal help. Gangs acted as enforcers. This bond tied street power to city power. Election days became dangerous. Fights broke out by design. Violence sent messages. Control mattered more than numbers. Winning a ward meant influence. Influence meant survival. Fire companies added another layer. Before a professional fire department, volunteers raced to fires. Each company had its own colors and symbols. Many were tied to gangs. Fires drew rival groups together. They fought for control of the scene. Tools became weapons. Buildings burned while men battled. Residents watched helplessly as homes collapsed. Fire became both disaster and excuse for violence. Police presence remained thin. Officers were underpaid. Many feared retaliation. Some accepted bribes. Others joined gangs for safety. Authority blurred. Trust faded. A major breaking point came in 1857. Two police forces claimed power over the city. One answered to the mayor, one answered to the state. When both tried to enforce control, chaos followed. Officers arrested officers. Fistfights erupted in public. Gangs chose sides. Crowds cheered. For days, New York lacked clear authority. This moment revealed a painful truth. The city could not control itself. Gang leaders gained fame. William Poole spoke openly against immigrants. He used violence to prove loyalty. His influence reached beyond the street. His death in 1855 drew thousands. His funeral stopped traffic. Shops closed. The city paused for a gang leader. Isaiah Reinders moved between politics and gangs. He organized rallies. He directed crowds. He helped tie street violence to national debates. His work showed how deeply gangs shaped public life. Newspapers followed every clash. They described bloodied streets and broken bodies. Readers consumed these reports daily. Fear mixed with fascination. Gangs became part of the city's identity. Yet many felt conflicted. Some feared gangs, others depended on them. For immigrants without legal protection, gangs offered security. They found work. They enforced local order. They punished betrayal. This does not excuse their actions. It explains their grip. The rivalry between the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits was more than personal. It reflected the larger tensions of the city. New York was divided between native-born Americans and immigrants, between wealth and poverty, between order and chaos. The Bowery Boys and Dead Rabbits became the faces of these divisions. Their battles were not small skirmishes. They were wars fought in the streets, with hundreds of men on each side. One of the most famous clashes came in July 1857. The Dead Rabbits marched through the streets, carrying a banner with a rabbit nailed to it. Hundreds of men followed, armed with clubs, knives, and pistols. The Bowery Boys met them head-on. The fight turned into a riot that spread across the city. Shops were looted, homes were attacked, and the police were powerless to stop it. The National Guard had to be called in, and only then did the violence subside. This event became known as the Dead Rabbits Riot, and it showed just how powerful the gangs had become. Bill the Butcher was central to this era. He was not only a gang leader, but also a political figure. He was tied to the nativist movement, which sought to limit the influence of immigrants. His presence in elections was strong, and his gang often intimidated voters. His death in 1855, after being shot in a saloon fight with Irish rivals, marked a turning point. The Bowery Boys lost their most feared leader, but their influence did not fade. The Dead Rabbits, too, had leaders who became legends. John Morrissey, an Irish immigrant, rose from the gang world to become a prizefighter and later a politician. His story showed how gang power could translate into political power. Morrissey's rise was not just about fists, it was about ambition and the ability to use the gang as a stepping stone to greater influence. The battles between the Dead Rabbits and Bowery Boys were not only about pride, they were tied to elections, jobs, and control of neighborhoods. Politicians relied on gangs to deliver votes, and gangs relied on politicians for protection. This relationship blurred the line between crime and politics. It meant that gang wars were not just street fights, they were struggles for real power in the city. These gangs used fire companies as extensions of their power. Fires were common in New York, and volunteer fire companies rushed to put them out. But gangs often controlled these companies. When a fire broke out, it was not unusual for gangs to fight each other at the scene, turning a disaster into a battlefield. The Bowery Boys, tied to fire companies, often clashed with rivals during these moments. The police force, still young and weak, struggled to contain the violence. Corruption was rampant, and officers were often tied to political machines that relied on gangs. This meant that gangs could act boldly, knowing they had protection. The Dead Rabbits and Bowery Boys thrived in this environment, growing stronger as the city grew more divided. The rise of these gangs also revealed the desperation of immigrant life. For many Irish immigrants, joining the Dead Rabbits was not about choice, but survival. They faced discrimination, poverty, and hostility. The gang gave them protection and a sense of community. For the Bowery Boys, gang life was about defending their place in the city against what they saw as an invasion. Both sides believed they were fighting for survival, and that belief fueled their battles. The Dead Rabbits riot of 1857 had already shown how violent these clashes could be. Hundreds of men fought openly, and the police were helpless. But that riot was only the beginning. The city was entering a period when riots seemed to erupt with frightening regularity, each one exposing the deep divisions of New York. One of the most infamous riots was the draft riots of 1863. Though sparked by the Civil War draft, the roots of the violence lay in the same tensions that had fueled gang wars for decades. The draft required men to serve in the Union Army, but the wealthy could pay for substitutes. The poor, especially Irish immigrants, had no such option. They felt betrayed, forced to fight in a war that they believed benefited others more than themselves. The gangs seized on this anger. The Dead Rabbits and other Irish gangs led mobs through the streets. They attacked draft offices, police stations, and homes. The violence quickly turned against black residents, who were seen as the cause of the war. Entire neighborhoods were burned, and families were hunted. The Bowery Boys, though nativist, also joined in, driven by their own resentment. For days, New York was in flames. The army had to be called in, and only then did the riots end. More than 100 people were killed, and the scars lasted for years. The draft riots were not the only time gangs turned riots into weapons. Earlier, in 1849, the Astor Place riot had shown how cultural disputes could explode into violence. The fight between two actors, one American, one British, became a symbol of class and national pride. Gangs filled the crowds, and when the militia fired into the mob, more than 20 people died. It was a reminder that in New York, entertainment, politics, and gang power were all intertwined. Riots were not always spontaneous. Politicians often used gangs to stir violence when it suited them. Elections were times of chaos, with gangs intimidating voters, stuffing ballot boxes, and fighting rivals. The Bowery Boys, tied to nativist politics, clashed with Irish gangs at polling places. Violence was part of the process, and the line between democracy and disorder was thin. Riots often began with small sparks. A fight in a tavern, a dispute at a fire, or an insult in the street could grow into something larger. Gangs were quick to rally their members, and crowds gathered fast in a city where people lived shoulder to shoulder. Within hours, a neighborhood could be engulfed in violence. The police force, though stronger than in earlier decades, was still no match for these riots. Officers were often tied to political machines, and their loyalty was uncertain. Some sided with gangs, others stood aside. When riots grew too large, the city had to call in the militia or the army. This reliance on military force showed how fragile order was in New York. The riots also revealed the deep racial tensions of the city. African Americans were often the targets of mob violence, especially during the draft riots. Their homes were burned, their churches destroyed, and many were killed. Gangs played a central role in this violence, showing how prejudice and poverty combined to create deadly outcomes. Yet riots were not only about destruction, they were also about power. For gangs, riots were opportunities to show strength, to challenge authority, and to claim territory. For politicians, they were tools to manipulate public opinion and control elections. For ordinary people, they were terrifying reminders of how unstable their city was. The image of New York during these riots is haunting. Streets filled with smoke, buildings burning, crowds shouting, and gangs marching with weapons in hand. The city seemed on the edge of collapse, and many wondered if it could survive. The gangs did not exist apart from the political world, they were part of it. They became tools for politicians, and in return, they gained protection and influence. This relationship created what many called a shadow government, where power was not only in City Hall, but also in the streets. The most powerful political machine of the time was Tammany Hall. It was the Democratic Party's base in New York, and it controlled elections, appointments, and favors. Tammany Hall needed votes, and gangs could deliver them. In neighborhoods filled with immigrants, gangs acted as enforcers. They intimidated rivals, stuffed ballot boxes, and made sure that the right candidates won. In return, Tammany Hall offered protection from the police and access to jobs. The Dead Rabbits were closely tied to Tammany Hall. Their leaders, such as John Morrissey, moved from gang life into politics. Morrissey's rise was remarkable. He began as a street fighter, became a prize fighter, and eventually entered Congress. His career showed how gang power could translate into political power. He was not alone. Many gang leaders became ward bosses, controlling neighborhoods and delivering votes. The Bowery Boys, tied to nativist politics, often clashed with Tammany Hall. They supported the Know Nothing movement, which opposed immigration and sought to limit the influence of Catholics. Their leader, Bill the Butcher, was a fierce opponent of Tammany Hall and its Irish allies. His death in 1855 weakened their political influence, but the Bowery Boys remained a force in elections. Elections in New York during this era were often violent. Gangs patrolled polling places, intimidating voters and fighting rivals. Ballot boxes were stolen, votes were counted multiple times, and corruption was rampant. Ordinary citizens often feared going to vote, knowing that gangs controlled the process. Democracy in New York was fragile, shaped as much by fists as by ballots. These gangs used their control of neighborhoods to influence daily life. They decided who could open businesses, who could live in certain areas, and who could find work. Their power was not only in elections, but in the everyday survival of the poor. For immigrants, joining a gang often meant access to resources that the city did not provide. Tammany Hall thrived on this system. It offered favors in exchange for loyalty. A job on the docks, a place in the fire company, or protection from the police could be secured through gang connections. This system kept the poor tied to the machine, and it kept gangs tied to politics. It was a cycle that reinforced itself, making gangs part of the city's political fabric. The police force, often under the influence of Tammany Hall, did little to stop gang violence. Officers were sometimes members of gangs themselves, or they looked the other way when gangs acted. This corruption meant that gangs could operate openly, knowing they had protection. The connection between gangs and politics also shaped the city's response to riots. During the draft riots of 1863, Tammany Hall leaders tried to calm the mobs, but their ties to gangs made their role complicated. They needed to maintain order, but they also needed to keep the loyalty of the poor. This balancing act showed how deeply gangs were woven into the political system. The shadow government of gangs and politics was not hidden. It was visible in the streets, in elections, and in the halls of power. Newspapers reported on gang influence, and citizens knew that their city was controlled by forces beyond the law. Yet the system endured because it served the interests of both gangs and politicians. The Civil War was a storm that swept across the United States, but in New York City, its impact was felt in ways that went beyond the battlefield. The war reshaped the city's politics, economy, and social life. It also transformed the gangs. They did not disappear during the war years. Instead, they adapted, finding new roles and new ways to exert influence. The draft riots of 1863 were the most dramatic example of this transformation. The gangs, already powerful in their neighborhoods, became leaders of the mobs that rose against the draft. The Dead Rabbits, the Roach Guards, and other Irish gangs rallied thousands of men. Their anger was not only about being forced to fight in a war they felt was not theirs, it was also about poverty, discrimination, and the belief that the wealthy could buy their way out of danger while the poor could not. The Bowery Boys also joined in the violence. Their resentment of the draft was tied to their belief that the war was being fought for causes that did not benefit them. The riots showed how gangs could channel broader social anger, turning it into organized violence. For days, New York was under siege, and the gangs were at the center of it. The Civil War also changed the city's economy. The docks became busier, factories produced goods for the war, and wealth flowed into the city. Gangs saw opportunities in this new economy. They controlled access to jobs on the docks, demanded payments from businesses, and expanded their influence. Their role as shadow rulers of neighborhoods grew stronger. These gangs were tied to bounty jumping during the war. Men were offered money to enlist in the army, but some gangs turned this into a scheme. Members would enlist, collect the bounty, desert, and then enlist again under a different name. This practice became widespread, and gangs played a central role in organizing it. It showed how they could exploit the war for profit, turning national crisis into local opportunity. The Civil War also deepened the connection between gangs and politics. Tammany Hall continued to rely on gangs to deliver votes, and the war years made this relationship even more important. With tensions high, politicians needed control, and gangs provided it. In return, gangs received protection and favors. The cycle of corruption continued, stronger than ever. The police force, though growing, was still limited. The draft riots had shown how powerless they could be against large mobs. The reliance on the army to restore order revealed the weakness of local authority. Gangs thrived in this environment, knowing that their power was unchecked in many neighborhoods. The Civil War also brought new immigrants to New York, adding to the city's diversity and tensions. Irish gangs grew stronger, while African American communities faced greater hostility. The violence of the draft riots against black residents left lasting scars, and gangs were central to that violence. It showed how prejudice and poverty combined to create deadly outcomes. Yet the war years were not only about destruction, they were also about transformation. Gangs began to see themselves not only as street fighters, but as political actors. Leaders like John Morrissey moved further into politics, using their gang connections to build careers. The line between gang leader and politician grew thinner, and the shadow government of New York became more entrenched. The Civil War era also marked the beginning of a shift in gang culture. The old street battles continued, but gangs were becoming more organized, more tied to economic and political systems. Their influence was no longer just in fights, it was in jobs, votes, and money. This transformation set the stage for the next phase of gang power in New York. 5 Points, still the heart of gang life, was more crowded than ever. Irish immigrants continued to dominate, but Italians and other groups were arriving too. Poverty was crushing, and the gangs offered what the city did not: protection, belonging, and a way to survive. The Dead Rabbits, though weakened by years of battles, remained a force. Other gangs rose to challenge them, such as the Riots, who would become infamous in the later decades of the century. The Bowery Boys began to fade. Their nativist cause lost strength as the city changed. The death of Bill the Butcher had robbed them of their most feared leader, and the Civil War had shifted attention to larger struggles. Yet their influence lingered, especially in the fire companies and in the culture of the Bowery district. The post-war years saw gangs becoming more organized. The Riots, for example, developed a system of fees for their services. They charged for assaults, murders, and other crimes, turning violence into a business. This level of organization was new, and it showed how gangs were evolving from street fighters into criminal enterprises. Gangs controlled theaters and entertainment. The Bowery was filled with theaters, and gangs often dominated the crowds. They decided who could perform, who could attend, and how shows unfolded. Their presence in entertainment reflected their broader role in shaping the culture of the city.
Politics remained deeply tied to gangs. Tammany Hall continued to rely on them to deliver votes, and gang leaders became ward bosses. They controlled neighborhoods, decided who could live where, and ensured loyalty to the machine. This relationship kept gangs powerful, even as the city tried to modernize. The police force grew stronger in the post-war years, but corruption remained. Officers were often tied to political machines, and gangs knew they could act boldly. The struggle for control between gangs and police was constant. Sometimes the police won, but often the gangs held their ground. The post-war years also saw the rise of new forms of violence. Street battles continued, but gangs began to use pistols more often, making fights deadlier. The old days of clubs and bricks were giving way to gunfire. This change reflected the broader transformation of the city, where technology and industry were reshaping daily life. The struggle for control was not only about violence, it was about identity. Immigrant gangs fought to defend their place in the city, while native-born groups tried to hold on to theirs. The city was becoming more diverse, and gangs reflected that diversity. Each group sought power, and the streets became the battleground.